Welcome everybody today to the CTSI Research Boot Camp. Our presenter today is Ness. Ann is the Clinical Trials Research Unit Oncology Service Manager at WVU Mary Bab Randolph Cancer Center, overseeing the clinical research nurses, coordinators, and data managers, as well as the Executive Director of the West Virginia Cancer Clinical Trials Network, a nonprofit affiliate with 6 hospitals across the state to bring cancer trials close to home. Ann has been involved in clinical research for almost 20 years. She first began her research career at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital in Cleveland while pursuing her nursing degree at Case Western Reserve University. After a few years' experience in the adult organ transplant, she returned to pediatrics as a cystic fibrosis research nurse. Ann returned to the adult arena in 2000 and started her now lengthy career in cancer research at University Hospitals of Cleveland, Sodman Cancer Center, concentrating in lung cancer and HIV malignancies when precision medicine was just blossoming concept in the lung cancer world. Ann joined the WVU in the summer of 2014 with the challenge to develop the WVU Mary Bab Randolph Cancer Center portfolio, as well as bringing the newly created West Virginia Cancer Clinical Trials Network from concept to a reality, and has greatly enjoyed the collaboration and reciprocal growth with the cancer team in the state.
Thank you. I always hate hearing almost 20 years in research. Hello, this is actually my first boot camp that I've attended, not just spoken at. So I thought, as I said, I thought Samantha sort of pulled one over on me. I thought I was going to speak to about 10 people in the small little room. So this is a much bigger space. So hopefully I can fill this up. I do have some handouts in the back of the room. I know I did not probably bring enough for everybody to have one. Some of these slides are a little verbose. I'm going to kind of fly through those and kind of just base on what our needs are on talking about this. It's a very broad subject. You know, the role and the function of a research coordinator can take days, weeks, months, years to master, depending on what your specialty area is. So we're just going to kind of go over those key functions. And then if you do have any questions, if you're looking to start research, if you want some access to the CTRU, then feel free to come up and ask me after. I also have my colleague is the manager of the non-cancer side for the research unit as well here. Okay, so I got to do this. That just kind of goes through our learning objectives. I'm going to go through the key 8 functional areas for research coordinators. I do want to highlight some of the resources that I don't know that everybody is aware of that you might want to take advantage of if you're starting a clinical research program here. First, the overview. We, as research coordinators, only function as a delegation of duties from our principal investigator. So if you are signing on to be a principal investigator for a clinical trial, part of signing on to your 1572 or what your accepting responsibility is that you are making sure that you're having appropriate delegation of any study-related tasks, that you've described and have committed to adequate training of your staff, as well as supervision of the staff, and then your responsibilities of oversight as that principal investigator to the research staff that you're working with. So what's the value of having a research coordinator? So I like this little picture over on the side there. Oh, the little diagram kind of blocks it. But most PIs are challenged to manage a clinical trial without the aid of some sort of study personnel. That may be a fellow, that may be a nurse, that may be a non-licensed personnel. It really depends on what the needs are. Research coordinators can be that bridge, so they're an invaluable resource and somebody that is generally well appreciated within that team. I like the little drawing on the right here, because that study coordinator, you know, what your mom thinks you do is you save the world. But if you ask what your friends think you do or what you think you do, you know, it's just this overwhelming thing of science and research and not really understanding what a clinical study coordinator does. Over here underneath the video that you can't see, what I actually do is a person overwhelmed in paperwork, just piles of that. So just a little humor. So the research coordinator, a nurse or a non-nurse. The first thing in your projects is really defining the scope of practice that your research coordinator will need to take on. If you're not using a licensed personnel, if you're using an LPN or a medical assistant or just somebody, a graduate student, somebody else that does not have a medical degree, you just have to be aware that you're operating within their scope of practice. That's including taking vital signs, blood draws, EKGs. It's not saying that they can't do it. You just have to have your documentation of training and then your delegation of duties. Right now, I'm really going to speak on the roles and the functions on the oncology side, so some of this might be sound a little bit more specific to cancer trials, and more really talking on the interventional scope of research. All right. So the key functional areas. We have the adherence to ethical standards, so we'll be the ethical police. Protocol compliance, managing what you may or may not be able to do within that protocol. Informed consent with the patients, in subject recruitment and retention is probably the largest part of our role. Management of our clinical trial patient subjects, I'll interchange those. Documentation and document management, as well as data management and informational technology. And then lastly is the finances. I think the part that the research coordinators least like to take care of. So the first thing is the adherence to ethical standards. You have all, if you're going to be involved with research, of course, completed your city training on human subject protection and good clinical practice, read your ICH guidelines, I'm sure read all the FDA guidances that are out there on what it takes to be an investigator, and have thoroughly digested all of those city modules. As that research coordinator, we do the same training with you. We are sitting there as the advocate. Nurses, we are always been patient advocates, and now it's sort of bridging over to also being protocol advocates and subject advocates. So we have to sit there and monitor what's not just best for us as a patient, but what's best for the overall protocol management as well. We'll promote our ongoing compliance. We'll also work with you on identifying vulnerable populations. If we have to work with having a different plan of care for patients who are prisoners, who are pregnant, who may have diminished capacity to understand. Of course, federal institutional procedures and regulations. Protocol compliance. So the biggest thing for a research coordinator that I know PIs depend on us is to know all the nitty-gritty details of your protocol. So our biggest role there is to make sure that we clearly understand our primary, secondary objectives, and we will help you in developing a plan if we're running an investigator-initiated trial on what we need to do to data collect or what sort of parameters we need to follow to make sure we could reach your objectives of that clinical study. We'll walk through feasibility, kind of looking through the historic numbers. Do we actually have the patients here to participate in this clinical trial? And then also what sort of implications may this have in our standard clinic, where we may have to make special arrangements, special infusion times, different arrangements with different departments in the hospital to make sure that these research patients are followed adequately. We'll work with your infusion nurses. We'll work with other departments, like I said, to provide them training to make sure that they can comply. We'll also help you develop documents and tools that we might have to do, assist with communicating to the IRB as we need to. Also, once you're doing a sponsored research project, they'll come in to do monitoring and auditing. So the research coordinators will help you with setting up those monitoring and auditing plans and then write those corrective action plans as we may need to as well. Informed consent. Now, over on the Cancer Center, the informed consent, of course, is an ongoing process, as we all know as well. But informed consent is really done in tandem with our treating physicians because they have to come out with the chemotherapy plan of care. In some other areas, the research coordinator may have a little bit more autonomy in the informed consent process and really work alone with meeting with the patients and defining what the protocol guidelines are and what needs to be collected, or you may find also it's a tandem project. The main part of informed consent, though, that the research coordinators always do need to make sure we're documenting is that continuous process. So when they're working with the patients, we follow our patients usually for life. we'll have to come in there every couple months and just remind them that they're on a protocol trial and that they are still willing to consent to this. We may ask you as a treating physician to just, assure in your notes that the patient continues on the study, that they're willing to do this, especially when we're changing their dose, either lowering or increasing their dose, or we're changing their treatment plan because of that clinical trial. We want to make sure that we're documenting that that patient's aware of this along their plan of care. You will see that we'll develop patient aids, informational aids for us, one-sheeters. How many people have been working with informed consents? Anybody here consenting subjects? So consent documents in the cancer world can be 20 to 40 pages long. And you're talking about patients who are already dealing with the concept of having this diagnosis, perhaps have already relapsed, are already in their second or third line of care, and now we're asking them to sit here and read a 30-page document. You guys probably have similar chronic disease settings that you'll be working with these patients. So it's not a simple thing to do and to go through and to maneuver. So sometimes we'll develop little aids, little diagrams that we can work as we're doing that dialogue with them. Patient recruitment. So recruitment plans is a big part of our clinical research, especially when you're taking healthy volunteers. It's how you're going to recruit and find these patients. I will talk a little bit later on about how you can pull some patients' information from the IDR and some recruitment aids that we have in the EPIC system as well for the hospital. But we'll help you with identifying needs and barriers and finding eligible patients. Any process changes that we might have to go if we're looking for healthy volunteers or long-term patients who have a diagnosis that may not be in the hospital setting. Sometimes we have to go out and we'll do community-based recruitment. You'll see us at marches and walks and talks, and we'll go to church events and do some other community outreach just to try to get those patients in and know that we're here to help them. Management of the clinical trial subjects. So you'll see that there's a big word on this that we repeat often, collaboration. We are there to collaborate with you as the investigator. I have had more than one investigator who's become quite upset at me when I have to tell them that they can't treat the patient because the protocol says it's not safe or it's not time, or we have to hold their dose, so we have to manage or do a dose reduction. That is that time where we are called the protocol police. That's the nice term. Sometimes it can be a little rude. But we're here to help you and partner to make sure that we have proper management of this clinical trial subject. Not, again, just for the protocol, but for the safety of the patients overall. We'll help you with coordinating your schedule of procedures. The one thing that you don't want to have to do at the end of your project is report a plethora of deviations because you scheduled your labs or your scans or something else was missed that we thought was a minute detail but was a requirement of the protocol. All those have to get reported to the IRB if we miss those. So the research coordinator will help you with that paperwork as well and keep you in compliance so that we don't have to have those deviations in your practice. Also, what's very popular and common is the correlative piece for a clinical trial. So we will work either collecting those ourselves. The coordinators will have their hazmat certification. They can help with collecting, processing, shipping out correlative samples. We may partner up with the Ruby Hospital Lab. We can also partner up over with the BioSpecimen Processing Core. And I'll talk about that a little bit later too, about the BPC and what they can help you with. So we'll work with the investigator to sort of know that protocol, the details, something called the adverse event scale. Those who are familiar with cancer might be familiar with the CTCAE, which is the common toxicity criteria for adverse events. It's a book about an inch thick of every side effect that could possibly happen to a patient. And grades them on a 0 through 5 scale to look for what their severity of their side effect is. And we're very specific. Now, some protocols that are out there in other more benign diseases or research areas that they're watching, they may not have that full, big, huge CTCAE, but the protocol should give them some guidelines on mild, moderate, severe toxicities or side effects and when we may need to hold or continue dosing. We strongly encourage you as a treating physician, if you're out here in the audience, to really make sure that you have a good understanding of that, but work with your coordinator to sort of understand. And that coordinator could reach out to your sponsor, to your monitor, and really clarify things prior to that visit coming in so you have a good plan of action prior to that visit. Documentation. If you can't see the wording on the cartoon, it says, and this is the form you send back to confirm you sent back all the other forms. And I know I have some data managers in the back who could probably say they do this multiple times a day. We have to send an email to confirm that they've sent the email. So, you know, there's a lot, as much documentation as we have in our medical practice. You do it twice over sometimes in the side of clinical trials. So we're even stricter on that if it's not documented, it wasn't done rule. So we'll help you with documenting your assessment, management, all your evaluation tools, collect outside labs. We spend a lot of time on the phone having outside records. Sometimes our clinical trials, we have to go back to any medical diagnosis the patient has ever had. So for some of these patients, that can be a quite lengthy time getting those medical records if they were seen at other places. Like most of our patients come here as second referrals. We'll help you with maintaining privacy confidentiality. We all work under the elements of HIPAA. Protecting PHI is an ultimate goal for us as well. So you'll see us that will help you with de-identifying records. We have radiology technicians in our research unit that help with de-identifying scans and having them submitted so that we can protect the PHI in that scope but still remain in compliance with the protocol. And then also helping any reports to regulatory agencies. If you're doing an investigator-initiated trial that you're holding what we call an investigational new drug or an IND, then we'll have to do routine reporting into the FDA as an annual basis as well, just to give an update of the study ourselves, because we're considered that sponsor of that study. Otherwise, if you're working with external sponsors, then you have to usually submit to them a continuing review and then also send that back to your IRB. Data management and information technology. So we're lucky in the CTRU that we have a larger base unit, that our staff, we have the research nurses, then we have non-nurse specialist research coordinators, we have a data manager team, and we have a regulatory team as well as business analysts. We understand that because we have a large unit, we're able to be highly specialized. Most research coordinators in smaller departments have to take all of these roles encompassed in one position. So as much as they have to be in the clinic seeing those patients, a very, very high important function is also to make sure that they maintain their data management. Most sponsors would like to have their data submitted to them if you're working with external agencies on the industry side. Well, I think they usually want it within 15 minutes of the visit, right? Yeah. They want it right now. But usually our contracts will say 5 days or so within that visit that they want to have that data submitted. So you have to make sure that you have the ability for your research coordinator to have the time to not only see the patients, but follow up with reporting that into your sponsors. And you want them to have that time to make sure they do it accurately. I think that's the other downfall sometimes when they're overwhelmed. We all take shortcuts, and then you may not have the data as clean as you want it, and you spend a lot of times later on reviewing and working on queries and resolving issues with it. The last key function is the financial stewardship. So when you have a new protocol, we say, oh, this is great, it's wonderful science, everything is here, yes, we definitely want to do this. This is something I've talked to my doctors, my colleagues about it, everyone's on board, and then someone's going to have to ask that horrible question of, how much are we getting paid? So your research coordinator will be the one that can help you with identifying what may fall in line with your standard of practice or your standard of care within your unit or your disease team, and then sort of negotiate a budget with that sponsor on really what can we allow. You really have to work with your hospital administration on this, determine cost. If you're not doing an interventional study, it may be an easier budget that you're looking at research lab personnel and you're just looking at effort for yourself to do your database maintenance and to do some more on just the IT function. But you do want to make sure that you accurately capture all your charges. All right, hints for success. I found a hey girl. So I'm just going to kind of go through little things here at WVU that you all may not be aware of, that if you're just starting up a research project may aid you with this. Okay, I'm going to give my first plug, ONCORE CTMS. ONCORE is a clinical trial management platform that we have at the Cancer Center and also through the CTSI. It's out there for any department at the hospital to work in. We use it for subject and protocol management. We are now starting to also use it for financial tracking and accounting tracking. There's the coverage analysis console. We use it for workflow and task management. It's a web-based application, so our institutions on the network that are across the state all have single sign-on access to this as well. So it's web-based. They can get their protocol, their consent forms, source documents, orders, anything else that we might want to have out there, that access to the research team. Access is limited by your role or by your study, by your department. So it can be something that if you're set up for your department to have it, only the people in your department can see your protocols and your studies and your patients. We do have some interfaces built with Epic to do medical record pull and demographic pull. And then we're hopefully that, eventually in Epic we'll have a little bit more interface development in 2018. The other thing that's nice about ONCORE is that we have a public study information portal. So we can go into our CTRU website that if the public comes out and wants to find out about research at WVU, your protocol is registered within the ONCORE system that they can sort and find that protocol complete with the contact information and links to the protocol through the nctclinicaltrials.gov website. So the biggest thing I'll tell you as a research coordinator that people, where they get themselves in trouble, is making sure you advocate not just for your patients and your protocol, but for yourself. Make sure that we have the training. If you're a PI and you're hiring a research coordinator, feel free to reach out to us for that training. We can certainly help you with that. We have a Barnett education series. We have some different presentations that we work with you. We have some guided training. We definitely have a competency-based training system that we're implementing right now. But you want to make sure that you know about clinical trials, what you can and can't do, know about your disease, know about the standards of your disease, not just what you're doing in the clinical study and that drug, because that clinical trial, if it really impacts what the standard of care delivery model is, and you're going out to the community setting to ask them to implement some new asthmatic medication or some RSV tracking, you want to make sure that it doesn't counteract with what they would do in their normal clinical practice. And we're going to talk about professional organizations at the end. This is, again, basically what I was just talking about a little bit ago, about knowing your protocol, knowing your disease. 3 main components that you need to have before you open up a clinical trial. One is your department approval. So everyone has to say that they have the infrastructure to support you, you as the PI, and support the research coordinator staff that you want to bring on. Financial approvals, including your budget preparation, and then regulatory approvals with the IRB, and then any other boards that you may have. If you're dealing with radiation, you have to have radiation safety, infectious diseases, or biosafety, if that's applicable to your protocol as well. So reviewing the feasibility. The large part for research coordinators is really trying to identify if we have a feasible population. So look at what your required subject population is, and looking at your personnel again, access to any equipment. Do you need to purchase equipment? Sometimes you have to purchase some lab processing equipment if we're going to do a pharmacokinetic or pharmacogenetic thing, or maybe you need to rent space in another lab or facility, or do a fee for service for processing on those. Ancillary department supports with pathology if you're doing fresh biopsies, how you're going to collect those and process those. And the largest thing that is never really considered when you're starting a clinical project is space. Do you have space for your research team, and do you have space for the storage of the documents after we have to keep them for 10 to 15 years and have volumes of charts? Thank God for Epic. We have much less paper than we've had before, but it's still a problem. So for feasibility, I'm going to recommend 2 resources I'm hoping everybody here knows about. IDR, you should. It's a CTSI, out of the CTSI funded core. But the integrated data repository is something that you can apply to have access to, where you can have de-identified data. But if you're starting off with a question of number of cases with a certain disease, or of a certain age, demographic, a certain CONMED, they can throw all that data together and get you a report on historically what we've seen here. And you can actually have access yourself to pull limited data sets, and then you can work with the IDR team at CTSI to get more in depth. The other thing that we're just rolling out that I'm not as familiar out here, I know Dr. Naeem is here, and he could probably speak more on Trinetics than I can, but Trinetics is another web-based interface that is basically like the IDR, but a little bit easier for you on the clinical coordinator side to navigate and to have access to. I know that I think they're rolling out some training with that. Is that in a couple weeks or next month or so, that everybody can have Trinetics X-site. Again, it's de-identified data, so you can't sit there and pull, give me the 10 subjects that have this diagnosis so I can start calling them. This is just giving you that historical reference information. Financial approval. I've had a couple calls actually in the last week about the process for financial budget and contracting oversight. So you do want to check to see who in your department needs to approve and track your budgets. It will be different if you're applying for a grant-funded project than it will be if you're doing something on the industry or a network-based side or investigator-initiated. So just make sure you have the correct pipeline. Again, this is what I reviewed earlier about make sure you have good planning. If you're working with patients and you're going to have to reverse some billable procedures that are going to be supported by research, work with your research coordinator and hospital finance team to make sure you have all of your procedures, professional and technical fees, tied with the CPT codes. It's not uncommon that people will get their CPT codes for the hospital side and then forget to also get the professional fees aligned with that budget. So you want to make sure that you balance both. You can't just write off anything that you're doing on the clinical side. You still have to generate a billing statement, but then you should just have the ability to say it's being covered and billed to the study, but you want to make sure that those activities are still billed out to the patient. The last thing on this, what we're talking about here is Medicare coverage analysis. That is highly recommended if you're doing any project that you might potentially be billing Medicare eligible patients. And actually many institutions across the nation require it for any clinical trial regardless of the patient population. And I think I'm going to talk about it. Next slide. Yes. So you want to look to see if you have a Medicare qualifying clinical trial. Medicare usually will cover any qualifying clinical trial, the routine cost of care. Anything that's considered reasonable and necessary items and anything that's used to diagnose and, this is the special key word here, and treat complications arising from participation in all clinical trials. So that is the big thing here, is that when you're treating your patients, they will cover the cost of your routine physical exams, your routine infusions, your routine blood work, as well as anything when you come in to bring those patients in for safety checks. So if it's something that's being done to prevent or treat complications of that research drug, you're allowed to bill that to insurance. But you have to make sure that it's a qualifying trial. So what is a qualifying trial? I will also say that we're arranging ACRP to do a talk on Medicare coverage analysis in April. What's the date? April 12th. That's going to be a webinar-based talk. We will disseminate the information out to anybody who's interested. If you want some information on that after the talk, just come up and talk to myself or Shelley. We'll make sure that you're here. We're going to have it over in our conference room in the CTRU. But I think it was good to talk about the basics of Medicare coverage analysis and a qualifying trial. The biggest thing for qualifying trials is therapeutic intent. So you just want to make sure that what you're doing has a therapeutic intent for your patients. You're not just doing a phase 1 trial or a dose-finding trial. You're actually going to treat your patients for that disease and that diagnosis. And then there's some more mandatory and desirable characteristics. I'll tell you, if anyone who's interested in finding out more, just let us know. So contract approvals. For any clinical trials here, we route our contract approvals through WVU OSP. That contracts office can take some time. They usually have a pile of contracts on their desk that they're already negotiating. So you do want to make sure that you get the contract to them with plenty of time before you need to start your project. They will want your budget negotiated prior to submitting your contract. So just make sure that you have that completed. Then you'll submit a blue sheet in the KC system. I'll show you those screens on the next slide as well. Now, if you are a research coordinator opening up a first trial, your PI is also going to have to go in there and log in and approve, and that's just that their attestation that they're aware this project is here and the funding mechanism and their contractual responsibilities for the project. I have a contact here, Janet Boyles, that I know we use, at least on the cancer side, for our KC proposals as well. So Office of Sponsored Programs has a website that is pretty easy to navigate. They'll talk to you about find funding, pre-awards, award negotiations, how to submit a proposal, how to work within their office. So if you do go into their award negotiation, then you'll see that there's a clinical trial review process link over here in the blue hyperlink. And that will walk you through step by step of what you need to do and into the KC system. And then I would also just call them if you're doing your first proposal. Regulatory approvals. Before you do a clinical trial, if you've had any talks, I don't know if has IRB, do they come in and talk at boot camp? They've had, I'm sure they have. I don't know if you guys have attended those, but they should go over the required documents that they need to submit a protocol to the IRB. But usually you'll have to have a signed protocol. You'll have to have your investigator CV. And we require our CVs to be signed, initial, and dated and updated on an annual basis. That's pretty much the standard on the industry side. So you do want to make sure you have a current CV. We can, for the federal projects, you'll move on a BioSketch form. Which is just a little bit more on the academic-based side of your CV. Proof of your city training, lab certifications, and lab normal ranges for any lab that is drawing labs that you'll be reporting data. So if your research coordinator is sending up labs for them to go back and they live in Cumberland and they're going to go to Western Maryland and get their routine labs, we're going to need the lab certifications and lab normals at that institution as well if it's going to be reported to the sponsor. Any IRB approval, any other safety committee approvals, anything else you'll want on letterhead, proof your letterhead, proof your approval dates. Make sure that everything matches with the IRB review information. Go through your informed consent. Really kind of when your research coordinator, if they're also doing a regulatory submission, they're going to have to work on that informed consent document for you. Patient recruitment materials, financial disclosure forms. Like I said, that pile of paperwork just grows and grows and grows. Now, many of these things can be kept electronically as long as that you have a compliant system for that. A lot of people are talking about the CFR Part 11 compliance. So right now we are migrating our things to, or have a plan to migrate some of our Red Docs to a SharePoint system. Otherwise, the auditors and monitors might require you to keep them in paper form. If you are doing your own study, if you're sponsoring your own trial, make sure that if you need to, that you have it registered on clinicaltrials.gov before you register your first patient on trial, or it may prohibit you from publishing your results later on. A link, just a website to the WVIRB, if you've used them. They have a hyperlink to your city program to get your ethics training. They also have a link to the WVUKC, which is, KC is the web-based system that I mentioned before for finance and contracts, but it's also where we submit our IRB proposals and regulatory. And then has your link to some training on how to create protocols. There is a link on the IRB site to do self-training in the KC system. I have not done that, but I am hoping that that link is still live, that they'll walk you through a training video. I know they've done a lot of upgrades over the past couple of years to make it more responsive to the staff or personnel submitting protocols, but we also know there are a lot of challenges with the system still. Start your protocol creation on that Create Protocol tab, and it will walk you through to fill out the questions. IRB provides consent form templates for a variety of trials. One thing also to note is if you think your study doesn't need to have IRB, you still need to talk to the IRB to get an exemption approval. So don't just assume because you're not collecting PHI, you're not collecting patient data, you're not doing that you believe that you're exempt trial, you still need to talk to the IRB and get that as a qualified exemption from them. The consent form templates on the website will have assent forms, consent forms, more than minimal risk forms, less than minimal risk forms, different things for tissue banking, different templates for you so that you just have to sort of plug and play. You know, drop in your language that's related to your protocol, merge it with something that's provided to you by your sponsor, and then work with your coordinators to get that submitted. Those who are new and going to be submitting their first proposals with the IRB office, just know that we do allow central IRBs. On the cancer side, we use the NCI central IRB. We've used Chesapeake IRB, Quorum IRB. I think the CPRC works with Western IRB. Right now, WVIRB will mandate any phase 1 trial and then any investigator-initiated trial to use their local WVU IRB. Otherwise, if it's a phase 2 to phase 4 clinical trial, you can use a central IRB. We have a relationship with Chesapeake if you don't already have a central IRB identified by your sponsor. Now, one thing to note, if you're using a central IRB, you do still have to go in and register it locally. So if you're using, if your study has a Quorum IRB approval, you will have to register it. Make sure you have the local language informed consent template when you submit that to Quorum, and then have approval with WVU, just because they need to be aware of what research is going on in the campus. The clinicaltrials.gov website, this is what I've mentioned before. It's the most widely used website for registering your clinical trial as per federal regulations before you publish. Now, protocol startup. The research coordinators are the designated project leaders, or delegated project leaders by the PI. Before we enroll any subjects, you'll see that we'll want to meet with medical staff, nursing staff, do some direct training. We'll do a study startup visit, usually when we kick off a project, but then if it takes a while for us to recruit some patients, we may go back and do a just-in-time sort of refresher with them. We want to make sure we have a completed training and delegation log. If you have a lot of research staff that what duty each coordinator has been trained and able to do on their scope of practice. Also make sure you develop any recruitment tools. They're approved by the IRB. Your coordinators will work with investigational pharmacy in developing research order sets. We do want research order sets, or investigational pharmacy will have order sets regardless if it's an inpatient or outpatient med with homegoing supply, because you want to make sure you have that documentation of the release of the study drug to the patients. And source documents we have as well, and we'll show you some of the examples that the CTRU has. And then patient compliance diaries. You want to make sure if you have homegoing meds that you have a way to document that patient's taking those appropriately at home. If you're new to clinical trials, I usually recommend that you have a site initiation visit meeting note. This is one template that another national research organization had that we modified for our site. It just kind of goes over, it gives us reminders over here on the first column of, like, if you're looking at eligibility criteria and baseline, make sure there are special reasons why patients would not meet eligibility if there's some random thing that isn't really standard in your disease setting. Any additional baseline procedures for screening that you wouldn't necessarily already have to do. Anything that some things come out in the site initiation visit that are not in the protocol. I know that we've had one thing with of when you dose the study drug in relationship to when the standard of care drug ends. And if it says on day 6 versus day 7, is it a time clock of within 24 hours? So these patients' treatment ends at 11 o'clock at night. Do you have to dose within 24 hours of 11 p.m.? Or if 11 p.m. on day 6 means that I can dose at 8 a.m. on day 7. So kind of identifying those little intricacies that may not be in that protocol. For feasibility and subject screening from EPIC, there are a couple tools out there. We talked about the feasibility with IDR and Trinetics. If you're actually wanting a live alert for patients that you may possibly be able to enroll, you can do you can set up a report with Tracy Cook-Carney that will send it to your inbox like a daily, weekly, or you can do something called an automatic trigger, which is a best practice advisory, that as soon as people come in with a couple different criteria. It can't be your complete eligibility, but if you want to say, I want to know everybody who comes in with an RSV diagnosis in the past 24 hours that also has a certain lab panel. If I want to know everybody who comes in here with diabetes and has an a hemoglobin A1C of whatever elevated level because you're working on a diabetic trial. You can have these alerts come to you to your inbox in Epic, and as I said, you can set it up with Tracy on however often on basis you want. Now, in addition, those who use MyChart, I don't know if anybody's clicked on the research tab, but if you click on the research tab, they'll talk to you about what a clinical trial is, and there'll be links on there to the CTSI, to the CTRU, to open clinical trials. But you can also work with Tracy to do some direct recruitment. So if you have a trial that you want to match into MyChart, then she can work with you on the verbiage. It has to be IRB approved, but she can help you with putting that to MyChart. And then you can also do direct patient, so pull out patients with MyChart and do direct communication with the patients through their physicians too. Chart review and pre-screening. If you are identifying patients that may be eligible for treatment, just make sure that you're not violating any HIPAA, that you're doing a limited chart review with these patients, that you're not collecting any PHI prior to having consent from these patients. You don't want to have a spreadsheet or something get in the wrong hands. If you don't have their consent to do it, you really can't do a full screening of these patients. So you work with your research coordinators. Our research coordinators will screen a clinic. They'll look for a diagnosis. They may look for a certain pathology, or if it's not a cancer patient, a certain lab result. But other than that, they stop because they have to then consent that patient to make sure before they do that deep dive into their medical records. This is our reminder that research personnel cannot initiate contact with potential subjects until, if you're giving a treatment trial, until that treating physician has discussed that possible trial option and you have that approval. So that physician needs to be that first line. So if you're recruiting out in the community, you need to speak to the treating physicians about possible patients before you call the patients themselves. I'll do a little dance. This just kind of walks through the informed consent process so you could have some more information. But really that study coordinator will help you with keeping that most current. We'll tell you if you're doing a research project, printing out 20 copies of your consent form and keeping in a clinic is not the best practice, only because consent forms change. Consent forms outdate, especially if you're not enrolling 20 patients in a short period of time. They may expire, and believe me, the last thing that you want to do is go back to a patient the next month and have them have to sign initial and date 20 pages again because they had an old version of the consent or had an expired consent. And then you also have to report it to the IRB and sponsor, and a lot of paperwork has to come in play. So please do not have multiple copies of them. That we use ONCORE, so we have our coordinators just print their consents as they're seeing their patients rather than have that liability. And then they'll work with you on the form consent process, as we talked about earlier. This is why I mentioned earlier, for us, the PIs are the ones who can consent. It's a good conversation for you to have with your research team. Can the fellows consent? Can your mid-level providers consent? It really is dependent on the trial, what's required of the trial, the treatment plan, what you're collecting, on what level of personnel can consent with your patients. Make sure, though, that anybody that does consent has the city training. They're knowledgeable about informed consent. They're knowledgeable about coercion. They know when they can ask a patient and when they need to stop. And they can also identify if the patient is well informed and has the capacity to understand what they're consenting to. This is what I was just talking about. Want to make sure you do it prior to any protocol-specific procedures, that we do it as a discussion, that we make sure we have quiet and privacy. You'll see a lot of research coordinators that are just opening doors, hoping that they can find empty room to sit there and talk to their patients and go through this process with them. And then just make sure they understand it's a process. So you as a PI might say, I have a patient and it's great, I want to sign their consent form today. We as the research coordinator are the ones that may sit there and say, we explained it to them, they're taking it home. We're going to call them tomorrow. Now if it's a blood draw, that's more than likely they can sign it that day. You can get your blood draw and you can move on. But if you're asking them to make a treatment decision involved with that clinical trial, then they need that time to process what the pros and cons of all of that is. Um, So this just talks about talking to your patients. Coordinators will always make sure we have this appropriate time with the patients, as I mentioned. Figuring out what the appropriate timeline is that is deemed by the patient. They're the ones that will tell you when they're ready. You cannot force them to sign that document. A lot of the doctors will say, well, just sign it today and then we'll talk to you about it tomorrow. When you're signing that document, it's saying that you understand everything that you're signing in. Whether you need to say, here it is, we will call you tomorrow. We'll schedule a phone call with your daughter, your sister, whoever it may be. I've had a research coordinator, and I've told this story to a lot of people. For a phase 1 clinical trial, it took her 6 weeks to get consent, and it was multiple phone calls for 6 weeks with this patient. But it was a phase 1 drug dealing with genetics, dealing with high-level, high-risk care, and patient had a lot of sons and daughters involved with their care, and they really wanted to make sure they made the right decision for that patient. So whatever it takes for them to feel comfortable with the decision. The last thing that you need is for any patient to ever call the hospital authorities and say, I was forced. I didn't know what I was getting into. So really take that time and take that time out. Do you guys read the cartoon? Can you read that? It's something like, it's a guy in a gurney in the emergency room. It says, of course the death was study related. He was reading the patient information sheet when the bus hit him. That's something with us for reporting. Once the consents are so long that you're so involved, and then study related, everything is study related. You have to always report everything. All right, assessing your knowledge and experience, alleviating the stress, the size of the document. As I mentioned, our documents will be 30 pages, and the last 15 of those pages will be all HIPAA regulatory, really dry information that you may be wanting to skip over, and again, it talks about their rights as a patient and participant on the trial, and it also talks about what you're responsible for versus what the patient's responsible for. So it's still heavy, important information to go through. This is just for us. This is our workflow process. So your research coordinators, when you're walking through with this, the blue boxes up top, this is our key duties. So we'll walk through, we'll have our consent form, we'll consent our patient, we'll review our eligibility with them, we complete our eligibility checklist, we gather everything, we register the patient on study, we do all that, and we start a patient on study. I think as a research coordinator, you can nod your head if PI says, oh, put that patient on trial, and they think that 2 hours later you can have that patient on study. But there are all these different steps that we have to sort of go through to make sure that the patient is eligible and ready to treat. Using eligibility checklists are important for you to have. With the registration forms, we just want to make sure anything that you say for eligibility, you have the original source. Doctors, physicians, you can't just say the patient has a diagnosis of, we're in the cancer world, we'll say a lung cancer or an EGFR positive, whatever it may be. We need that pathology report to do that actual original documentation. We need actual cardiac testing, not just what their LVEF is stated in a note. IDS, those who are using investigational drug supply, make sure that you're working in conjunction with the WVU Investigational Drug Services. They'll store your drug, write the order sets, as I mentioned, do all your, help you with dispensing, labeling your drug, collecting your drug, working with your monitors for your inventory control. They'll order temp logs, temp monitoring, anything else. Keeping drug in your office at your desk. I know some departments do it. So you have to make sure that you have the proper security measures in place, proper temperature controls, proper monitoring logs. I really strongly advise working with the IDS. Correlative collection, some people use the hospital services to do some sample processing. There also is the biospecimen processing core. We use them on the cancer side. They're available on the non-cancer side as well. To do blood sample collection, they go to some of our units and collect PK samples, as well as just working with the VAD, the lab, in taking the tubes of blood processing, and they'll either do the direct ships that day, or they'll store and they'll do shipping whenever it's required for your study for you. They can do simple spin and ships, as we call, or they can also do some more complicated processing just based on what your needs are. AE capturing, this is what we're talking about in protocol compliance. I know my time's running out, so I'm going to kind of quickly go through that. This is just making sure you're educated on how to collect your data, your research coordinator has access to your records, and that you as the treating personnel are documenting in real time so that we have the ability to abstract all the side effects that may be happening with that patient. Making sure you're determining your attribution and your expectedness. There are two different things. If it's attributed to the study drug, and is it actually expected to the study drug, are two, will also create two different pathways if you have to do expedited reporting versus standard AE reporting. Make sure they have proper source data and source documents, as I've mentioned before. We do use Epic EMR. We'll do a lot of notes in Epic EMR that we send to our physicians to co-sign. We'll do smart phrases as much as we can. This is a look at some of the tools that we've created. Up here is informed consent process document that has all the 8 required elements of informed consent that we have to document. The nurses fill this out, send it out to the physicians to co-sign. We have a new patient checklist that you as a treating physician or research coordinator can do that says all the activities that are required for your patient. We also have a study visit checklist that people develop per visit, per cycle 1, day 100 of a visit, day whatever it may be, follow up, so to make sure that they have everything completed when that patient's here. And this is an adverse event log that we use on the cancer side as well that tracks our start dates, stop dates, grades, attributions, expectedness, if it was a DLT or an SAE. Oops, I went backwards. Case report forms. Anytime you have a source data, you wrote it into the case report form. You cannot report anything to the sponsor unless it's written and also in your source data documents. CRF completion, you'll sign off as an investigator at the end of your study that all of your data was reported according to GCP section 4.9.1, that it's accurate, complete, legible, timely, and that it is a complete picture of your patient. One thing that I have in here in the notes, and I'm not going to go through this because it can be a couple of slides here, is making sure you add yourself as an EPIC provider. The reason I'm going to add, the biggest reason that you may want to add yourself as a provider, and you can do this as a research coordinator, is that you're allowed down here to get notifications if the patients are admitted, and you're allowed to get notifications for additional testing results. So if you want all results in your inbox, or if you just want all the abnormal results in your inbox, or you can hit this at none. So you can self-determine what you would like and add yourself as a care provider. Us on the cancer side, we do not do the testing results usually, because if we wanted every abnormal lab, our inbox would be completely overwhelming. But a lot of us will do admissions, because if we have a patient that's hospitalized, we usually have to report within 24 hours or at 5 days, depending on what type of event it is. So we'll get a message in our inbox then if a patient was admitted on Friday night to make sure that we can track them within that reporting period. This will walk through how to document patients on a clinical trial on EPIC. We don't really have a banner system. We're working with them on doing that, but you can put it in as a problem list right now. So this is just kind of walks through on adding it as a problem list for you. Monitoring and auditing, your research coordinators will work with your sponsors on routine monitoring and routine auditing. If you have an FDA audit, that's something that you'll want to elevate and talk to IRB or research people. Give us a call if the FDA gives you a call, and we can help you work through that. So for those who are really interested in a career in research, there are a lot of guidelines that have been released in the last 2 years. This article talks about moving from compliance to competency. Our big thing in clinical trials has always been, are you compliant, are you compliant, are you compliant? Is the FDA going to come in and shut you down? And the FDA is starting to turn a little bit and saying, are you compliant, but were you competent to do this? And was the staff that was there that was competent to do this? So I think that's, if you're going to be an investigator in clinical trials and listening to this talk, one of the most important things for you to look at is your team able to do this? Did you train them effectively? And did you document that training? and really kind of working through these 8 core principles of what is involved if you want to be a lifetime career in clinical research. 2 professional organizations, SOCRA and ACRP. We are a SOCRA testing site. I think my next up here, you'll see some SOCRA prep classes that we offer, and then we have SOCRA test on May 25th. This year. So we would like to have 10 people take that. We also have some ACRP certified. Shelley is ACRP. I know a lot of other nurses on campus are ACRP certified. So, we really strongly encourage anyone after a couple years of research background to go and get your certification. All right. So I came back to my study coordinator. So hopefully you have a little bit of an idea of what it is that we do. Again, we work in the lab. My mom will continuously still say I save the world, as all proud moms should do. But then what we feel like we're doing, popping pills in patients' throats and sitting with paperwork. So after that, does anybody have any questions?